Welcome to What Have We Become? My name is Cheryl and I'm the host of this podcast, where I'll talk about different topics revolving our daily life. And let's get started with today's topic. In today's episode, I'll be talking about the Great Resignation Wave. So I'm sure many of you had heard of this term, the Great Resignation Wave. Probably a couple of months back, I think it was early 2022, where this phrase started surging in a lot of news articles, and many people was posting about this topic because it has a surge in the early part of 2022, and it's a phenomenon that I think a lot of us notice, where people around our friends, people around us, our colleagues, a lot of people are actually quitting their job. And I think a big part of the reason would likely be due to the pandemic. That's my understanding. And I think if you see different articles, there are different reasons why that has been listed out about why people are resigning collectively in the same period of time. So I understand that it could be a reason where, because a lot of people stayed in the same job during the period of the pandemic just because it was more stable, and a lot of people were afraid of changing a job just because things were uncertain. And if they do change their job, it's very hard to confirm whether they can get a better offer or if that job would even be stable. So most people actually just keep their current position and stay at the job where it was confirmed that they would get a stable income, at least for the foreseeable future. So I think a lot of people just tolerated or just managed with what they have at the point of time. So most people were actually holding back and not considering changing a job because they know that the market wasn't doing well, and weren't sure if things would get better. But I realized that I think the point where the situation was getting better, cases were slightly reducing, and you see that the economy is actually doing decently well. Not the best, but it's not suffering as bad as we all think at some point of time in a lot of people's career. So I think that moment where we felt that things are getting better, so it's time for a change. But I think beyond that, I think there's a lot of things that were in the thoughts of a lot of people who were going through the decision of, do they want to quit their job? I think one big consideration was that it's been stagnant for a good 2 years period of time. Also, I think many people just wanted to look for a change. After being stagnant for 2 years without much changes and having the same job, having the same lifestyle, I think that actually made a lot of people want to have a change in lifestyle. And that might be one reason why people are resigning from their job collective at the same period of time. I think it's a phenomenon that we do notice, people actually doing similar things at the same time. I think one example would be the boomer generation, that after the war, people were giving birth to more children just because life was slightly better. Not the best, but definitely in a better situation. And I do see that this is a similar case with the pandemic and the resignation wave. So I think that's one of the reasons. But thinking about that, probably another reason would be that things are different. We have experienced working from home during the 2 years, and I think that gave us a new perspective in how our career should be. It's not just about having pent up emotions where we don't want to stay in the same job, it's too stagnant. I think it's really more about trying to be in a different space where we realize our situation were not the same as it used to be before the pandemic situation. And I think this is a good point to move to our second segment, which I'll get to it just in a second. So, moving to the second segment, what I would like to discuss is what has changed to the way people resigned from their job before the pandemic and after the pandemic. I think prior to the pandemic, although to be honest, before the pandemic happened, I didn't had a chance to resign from a job before because I was never in a full-time job prior to that because I was still studying. But what I understood just based on readings and talking to people is that before that, people were quitting their jobs to get a better offer, to maybe have a career change, and it was sort of not as common in a case where people just changed their job because they were sick of it. That's not usually the main reason. Most of the time it was because they wanted to progress, they wanted to have better salary. I think that was the majority of the reason. It was very career driven type of reasoning. Whereas I think post pandemic, a lot of the reason were more internal. It's really sort of how we feel, which is why we decide to resign. That's just based on my personal experience and people I've talked to. I think a lot of cases were people feeling overwhelmed, overworked, or just really tired from working from home, or just a situation where they couldn't change their job for a long period of time. And I think that was the case for many people, just because we don't really have that opportunity to change job during the pandemic period because of the risk. So I think in the normal cases, people would actually have changed their job during the pandemic if they could. But because of the pandemic, they actually avoided that decision. So what has changed after pandemic, in my opinion, is that people are valuing more how they feel, which is why they changed their job. I think to get to more detail about it, one note or one post that I saw, I think a while back on LinkedIn, is that people used to be loyal to their job and they only change when they feel that they need to progress further. Whereas people nowadays, we are often called as not loyal to our job, but it's actually because we are more loyal to our mental health. We care more about how we feel mentally, and we make decision about our career based on that, not about the income, not about the career progression, not about how much money you get. We really value our personal time more than ever. And that speaks truth for myself as well. Knowing that prior to the pandemic, probably I would join a job that I could earn money from, and if a better opportunity comes by, I would take it and then change to another job. But I think during the pandemic period, I do realize that I was afraid of finding a new job because I wasn't sure if I would get a stable career and how would the situation be. Were we going to work from home? Were we going to work in the office? What if there was COVID cases happening in my new office? It was things that all this kind of uncertainty was something that was preventing me from trying to get a new job. I felt more comforted to keep my current role at a point in time just because it was definitely more stable and I was already comfortable where I was at. So I didn't felt that there was a need to change my job at a point in time. But going through 2 years of staying in the same role because of that fear of uncertainty, I became more overwhelmed. So when I speak to people around me, a lot of time the reason why they choose to resign is because the job market post-pandemic was much better. And I think a lot of people say that it's actually the employees market because employees had the opportunity to choose jobs that they wanted. So it was actually the employees' advantage at that point in time. So a lot of people noticed that and decided that it's a good time to resign. And also, after experiencing the flexibility of working from home and the change in working style, I think we do realize that we need to value our own time more than ever. So I think that's one of the key change that I do notice post pandemic and pre pandemic. Moving to the next segment, I would like to talk a little bit about my personal experience with sending my first resignation letter. It honestly was a really difficult decision to make, just because the thought has been sitting in my head for a really long time when I first wanted to quit my first full-time job. It felt difficult because I had a good relationship with the job. It was my first job and I enjoyed it. I really liked my colleagues and they felt like a second family. In fact, I actually spent more time with my colleagues than my own family. So when that thought of resigning from my job came about, I wasn't sure about it. I had to think about it really for a long time, just so I could be sure that I wanted to go ahead with this decision. I think a very good example or like an analogy of how it felt like would be comparing it to breaking up a long-term relationship. Honestly, when the thought came about, I really had to consider, do I really want to quit the job? Is it okay if I stay on the job for a little bit longer? Maybe things would improve in a couple of months. Maybe I would feel better about the situation. I think if you think about a relationship, you probably would see some parallels in that, which I think is the reason why it's so difficult, because you have actually formed a emotional bond with your first job or the job that you have. And that's why for me, it was a very difficult decision. I think a great adjective to call it is that it's a really bittersweet experience, because you know that for a fact you want to quit the job, but at the same time you do miss the time that you had and the experiences that you gained from that job. So it wasn't an easy decision. It took me a really long time, probably a couple of months, before I actually set my mind to resign from my first full-time job. So I won't go too much into detail about it, just because I just wanted to bring up the analogy that it really felt like breaking up a relationship. I spoke to another friend of mine as well, and I talked about this analogy, and she also agreed, because especially in smaller companies or smaller teams, you feel that your team members are really close, close friends with you. So it felt like you're separating from them, and it was a difficult action to go about. But all in all, I think once you decide that you want to resign from a job, there's a reason for that. So that's just a small segment about my personal experience, just because I don't want to go too into detail about it. And I think another thing that I think would be really useful to know about, I will talk about more in the next segment, which is the process of resignation and the things that you should consider before you actually proceed. Because I don't think this has been talked about much in most situations. Moving to segment 4, the resignation process and things that you should consider. I think one reason why I wanted to go through this topic is because when the first instance where I wanted to resign my job, I didn't know where to start. I never had an experience of having to resign from a job, just because my previous jobs were all internship or part-time roles where it wasn't difficult to quit that job. Internship ends once the period is up. For example, 3 months is up, so you leave the job. 6 months is up, so you leave the job. It's something that was very natural at that point in time, because you had to go back to school, so you couldn't work anymore. And a part-time job was similar, because it was a short-term job where you knew that you would be leaving that job eventually. But when it came to a full-time job, that experience was different. Like I mentioned earlier, it felt like a long-term relationship where you had to break up from that. And I also personally found it hard to go about the situation just because it was never a topic that came up in school or in my university. No one ever talked about how to resign from a job. It's always talking about career. How do you get a job? How do you find a job? How do you find your career? It's never about how to leave a job that you were at for a long period of time. I think it's much easier to leave a job when you have not formed the emotional bond yet. But when you do form the emotional bond, how do you actually leave the job? How do you raise up the topic? And what are the things that you need to consider? I think firstly is, how do you actually resign from your job? That was something that I didn't know how to go about. Do I send a letter to the HR? Do I speak to my manager? Or what do I actually do? So that was a big question I had at the point in time. So what I actually did is I asked my colleagues who actually resigned, and I just asked them how did they go about it, what did they do. And I think this process will vary largely depending on the company you're at. Personally, for me, I was in a small company, about 30 to 50 people. So in that company size, I knew just about everyone in the company, and I had contact with my direct boss as well as my department head. So in that process, I think even different colleagues actually did it slightly differently. Some actually spoke to their manager directly, and that was the form of resignation for them. Some sent a letter over email with the boss, or sometimes just with the department head. So in my case, after I spoke to different people and understand how they resign from their job, what I did is I spoke to my manager directly, and then I sent a letter shortly after. So that was the way I went about. And in that letter itself, I also copied the HR, I copied my boss, and mainly addressed it to the boss and my department head. So that's how I figured out what to do, just because I never heard anyone talking about it in school. So I really didn't know how to go about it. And I had to ask around just to know what is the process. In fact, there was actually more things that I was considering back then. I think even the letter, what do I put in the letter? Do I need to have a physical letter, or can I just send it on email? But at the time I was working from home largely, so I think email was the way that I went about. But I think in some cases it might actually be a physical letter. I'm not sure about bigger companies, but I think generally that's the case where you send an email out. And a few things that you should consider is, actually there's quite a few things that you should consider. Do you have a backup option? Are you resigning without a alternative option? Are you resigning to get a break? These are things that I think you should consider before you resign from your job. Not that it would be a big impact on your decision if you have already set your mind, but it definitely does impact how you would proceed after you are done with your notice period. So I think one thing you need to consider as well is, how long is your notice period? You need to know what term do you need to serve. So I think I won't be giving like a detailed explanation about what to include in a resignation letter. You can probably find it out online, or maybe speak to your friends, speak to the people around you, just to understand what is needed in the letter itself. But just going through things that you can consider is, like I said, a backup option. What is your option after you quit this job? Do you plan to rest, get a break, or do you want to find a job? In most cases, most people that I know, they actually do have a backup option, meaning they have found a job before they resign from their job, their current role. For me, I didn't do so. I wanted to close the year, so I left my job just so that I could end it before the following year. And I didn't have any decision on what to do after that. It was more easygoing for me just because I wanted to go with the flow. If I found a job, that'll be great. If I don't, I'll take a rest. But a lot of people, they may not have that option of not getting a job. So you need to consider whether you can afford to be not working for that short period of time. If not, it would be safer to find a backup option before you actually send your resignation letter. So that's an important thing to consider. Then I have a few more tips which I'll go through in detail just in a bit. So moving to the last segment is some tips that I think it would be useful for people who are considering if they want to leave their job. And I think these are just a tip of the iceberg. Probably you should speak to people around you, just know about more details before you commit to a decision, just because it is quite a big decision, especially if it's your first resignation. But if it's not your first, probably you're already familiar with it, but maybe just some tips that might be helpful. I think one thing that I heard from an ex-colleague, which I found to be quite useful, is that you shouldn't be leaving a job with negative emotions. Ideally, you are leaving a job with a happy emotions. So you're not keeping any unhappiness as you leave the job, just because that will actually give you a bad impression for yourself about your old job. And also, I think that impression is also something that can be felt by other people, which actually moves on to my next tip is try not to burn the bridges. You never really know when you need that connection, even if you know you don't like the people, but you should not intentionally burn the bridge, because they might be someone that you meet in the future, or they might influence someone that will hire you in the future, or a colleague that you have. It's always safer to just keep the bridge. You don't have to fluff things up and make it sound like you love them so much, but don't intentionally break the relationship or say something hurtful or act very, very cold towards them. Just trying to keep it neutral, keep it professional. A next point is actually something that's more personal to me. I don't think everyone does that, but for me, I want to create a convincing narrative of why I decided to move to a new career and leave the current job. This is not like creating a storyline, but more so creating something that you yourself believe, and this is the reason why you don't think you should stay at this role any further. It could be simple things like, I want to try another career, I want to have a career change, or I want to develop further in this other industry, I want to learn a different skill set, I want to try working in a bigger company. Just something that you believe in, and I think it just helps, because this kind of question does come up when you have your exit interview. Why are you leaving your current job? What are the reasons for that? So I think if you have a convincing narrative, it helps with the process just for yourself, so that you are convinced by your own decision, especially if you are pondering, thinking whether you want to quit your job. I think this narrative itself just help you to set your mind up. That moves on to my next tip, is to be firm with your decision. I think while you're considering, it's okay to not be finalized, but I think once you decide a decision, it's ideal to be firm about it, so you don't resign and then you just regret about it. I think once you have done it, keep to it and follow through, because you have already thought through the processes and you already think through everything, and that's the conclusion you came up with. So stick to it, be firm about it. But another thing that you can consider is, are you open to a counter offer? In a lot of company, they do have a counter offer. Maybe things such as pay raise, for example, or change in the way the company works, or maybe a promotion. There's a few things that could come up in the counter offer. It really depends on your position in a company, your contribution to it, and what the company's position is about it. It really depends case by case. So those examples that I listed before may or may not be valid in your situation. But that's something that you should consider. Are you open to a counter offer, or are you final about it, meaning no offers will change your decision? So that's something important, just because if you are open to a counter offer, that's more important that you, when you send your letter, you don't sound too harsh about it, and give yourself space so that your HR or your boss actually has the space to give you a counter offer. But that's really up to you. Then I think the next point is just think about, do you think your decision will actually change after the counter offer? If you don't think it would change, then most likely you have already set your mind about it. Next thing is more just administrative stuff. It's important to know how long is your notice period, because it actually affects quite a significant bit. Because if you are feeling unhappy about your current role or very stressed out by it, and you have a long notice period to serve, it may be difficult to go through that notice period, especially if your notice period is long. And also, that affects whether you have a backup option. So if you have a job that's upcoming, that notice period that you have will affect when you can start your next job. So do consider how long is your notice period. Another point to consider is how many leaves do you have? Because if you fully utilize your leave, there's a chance that you might have to pay back the leave that you have taken if you have passed the limit for your period that you are serving. But in some cases, you actually might have spare leave where you might be able to offset them or convert them into cash instead. Or you could still take the leave and shorten your notice period. So those are things that you might be able to do with your leave, but it's really dependent on company as well. So I think those are just some small tips that I have. Hopefully they are helpful. So to conclude about this topic about the resignation, starting from the resignation wave to my own experience, the process, and some tips, I think just want to give some pointers to people who actually listen to this job or are actually considering to resign from the job, or are struggling with their work-life balance or something about their work. Just a few things that I found personally quite helpful is that I think, let's say you are deciding whether you should quit a job and you feel that you might be letting down your colleagues, and that's a feeling that I had experienced before as well. But a key thing to note is no one is irreplaceable at work, but you are not replaceable in your own life. So you should always prioritize yourself over your job. And that's something that I think a lot of people fail to notice until it's too late, or they have actually spent a lot of their time at their work already. So I think one final tip is just always consider yourself first when making a decision, and don't be too concerned about how things will go, because ultimately the company will survive. The team will be able to do things as it should be, and projects will still go on. So I think this episode has been something that is quite close to my heart, because it's something that I felt would be really useful if I had known about early on in my career. But I guess it's just a good point to just discuss about things that I learned and my experiences as well. So I hope this was helpful, and that's all for today. To close off, be yourself and take care.